Before Tick, Tick, Boom came out, if you knew who Jonathan Larson was, it was as the creator of Rent the Musical. And maybe you even knew that he died tragically of an aortic aneurysm the night of the final dress rehearsal of Rent, meaning he died on the eve of the first public performance. So he never got to see Rent do its magic with a paying audience. He never got to see his work change musical theater forever. Yet through Rent and his one-man show Tick, Tick, Boom, now a movie directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda, Larson has left a lasting legacy that has inspired and continues to inspire musical theater writers who have come after him. To understand Larson's outsized effect on musicals, perhaps we can use an analogy from pop music. It's sometimes said that the rock band, the Velvet Underground, didn't sell many records, but everyone who bought one went out and started a band themselves. Well, in a way, Larson was the Velvet Underground of musical theater, paving the way for future composers, book writers, and lyricists to go beyond what came before. Some people who saw Tick, Tick, Boom on stage, like Lin-Manuel Miranda,
I saw Rent on my 17th birthday,
would go on to change musical theater themselves. But what exactly was so influential about Larson and his work? Here are 6 ways Sondheim and Larson woke up a generation. Number 1. Curriculum. In 1990, Tick, Tick, Boom began as a monologue with Jonathan Larson telling his story through songs played and sung by himself at the piano and with a rock band. In it, Larson detailed what it was like being a young musical theater composer who wanted to revolutionize the art form, but was still struggling to get his work produced or even noticed.
Yeah, it sounds like my show!
It sounds daunting today trying to get your musical noticed, but in 1990, it was perhaps even more challenging. For one thing, compared to today, New York City was a very different place.
It was so dangerous and scary. Nobody wanted to live in New York.
And this guy would know.
I moved to New York City in 1990. My first apartment in 1990 was in the middle of Alphabet City.
A new member of the Alphabet City avant-garde.
And the first meal I ever ate in New York City when I moved there was at the Life Cafe.
Come to the Life Cafe after Maureen's show.
And you are?
My name is Tim Kirkman. I'm a writer and a director and a producer, primarily of feature films. It was the world that he described, with people squatting. It was volatile and there were artists everywhere because artists could afford to live there.
Larson knew he had to persist in Manhattan if he was going to make a lasting impact in the musical theater world.
I can't leave New York.
And his persistence paid off, leading to the creation of Rent. Cut to 2001, 5 years after Larson's death, Tick, Tick, Boom was revived, but this time as a 3-person musical with Larson's original songs and a new book adapted from Larson's monologue by David Auburn, who himself was a Tony and Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. It was this 2001 production that Lin-Manuel Miranda saw.
I saw Tick, Tick, Boom 3 times my senior year in college.
Which was the perfect time for him to watch it because that's when he was writing his first musical, In the Heights. Lin would deepen the lesson when he starred as Jonathan Larson in a 2014 production of Tick, Tick, Boom.
It's 3090. Why?
But more than just inspiring Lin and others through the shared experience of struggling as musical theater writers, I think Larson actually ended up having an outsized influence because he consciously created a curriculum for future writers to follow. For example, he described his relationships with his mentor, Stephen Sondheim, who in the stage show represented a person so great he couldn't even articulate his full name. In the film and in Larson's real life, Sondheim played a major role in shaping Larson's career. Sondheim would write letters of recommendation for him and also allow Larson to observe in person the creation of his newest Broadway show at the time, Into the Woods. Sondheim knew that his pedigree was important to share because Sondheim himself had been propelled by a similar pedigree when he was a young composer and writer. Sondheim was mentored by Oscar Hammerstein when he was just a kid. Yes, that's right, that Hammerstein. And it was Hammerstein who gave Sondheim a curriculum as well.
And he set up a course for me, so to speak. He said, if you want to learn to write musicals, why don't you take a good play and make it into a musical?
Okay, so just adapt a musical based on a good play. That doesn't sound too hard.
And he also advised me that to learn, I should
try adapting a play on my own, first a good play, then a bad play, then a non-play like a book, and then finally an original, and I did.
Yes, the actual course was to have Sondheim write 4 full-length musicals before becoming a professional. Fun fact, the book he chose for his non-play was actually Mary Poppins, which he never finished. Years later, Sondheim would pay that mentorship forward to Larson, whose own Superbia was based on the George Orwell novel 1984, another non-play adaptation. Even Larson's time backstage as Sondheim's guest at Into the Woods had a precedent, with Sondheim himself being given similar backstage access to a Hammerstein musical.
When I was 17, I became his assistant on a show called Allegro, which was the 3rd show that he and Rogers Rodman had written. So I was a gopher. I got coffee and I typed script, and I watched the process live.
And in a way, Tick, Tick, Boom is Larson's way of paying that forward to Lin and everyone lucky enough to see the show.
It was a sneak preview of what my life would be, and it was a blueprint for me to follow.
And by extension, Lin is now paying that forward to everybody with a Netflix account. Larson's story gave musical writers a sense of what to expect in the industry.
Ending relationships because you need time to write.
I can't move to the Berkshires.
You have that one mentor that praises your work.
First-rate lyric and tune.
And you can dine out on that for a month. You know, having workshops that go nowhere.
I have rejection letters from every major and minor producer, theater company, record label, and film studio in existence.
He was sort of at this point where this thing he'd invested all of this time, all of this energy and effort into was not going to happen.
That's J Collis, whose book Boho Days Lin-Manuel Miranda called The Larson Deep Dive. And he says the failure of Superbia left Larson feeling the need to prove himself.
He was told a lot as well. Superbia is too expensive. It's sci-fi. You want all these fancy effects. It's a cast of 15. You can't do this. He's like, fine, I'm going to do something that's so small and so cheap that you can't tell me no one can afford to put this on.
Hence, the birth of Tick, Tick, Boom. Tick, Tick, Boom reveals a life with over a decade of toiling on shows that never saw the light of day. More importantly, Tick, Tick, Boom emphasizes the importance of revisions, especially writing that one great song which might make or break a show.
And if the song doesn't work, the show doesn't work, and then it's all been a waste of time.
Which culminates in the emotional come to your senses.
Come to your senses.
Of course, Larson would return to that theme in Rent, where Roger sings One Song Glory.
One song, glory.
About the fear of dying before writing his one great song. Tick, Tick, Boom pays homage to One Song Glory with this Easter egg of Larson playing it on the keyboard. Speaking of Larson at the keyboard, Lin-Manuel Miranda notes that the opening piano riff of 3090 doesn't repeat.
It's like dun 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 dun. But he never does it the same way twice until the beat drops. I think he's trying to mimic what it sounds like to work on a song until you find it. Just having this like note be a little different until it settles into what it is.
Which is yet another lesson from Larson on the tenacity required for songwriting, which inspired Lin to create a similar idea for his intro in the iconic Wait For It.
Right? And you think it's going to be the same? It's different just that one time. I know.
But aside from demonstrating the songwriting process, Larson even got more specific than that. He even left us with an actual curriculum. For example, Larson encouraged fans of musicals to be well read.
Bookshelves sagging under the weight of plays and novels I didn't write.
He stressed the importance of having lots of books lying around, and he continued that lesson in Rent as well, where he created his most curriculum-esque song as the Act 1 closer of Rent, La Vie Bohème, itself a reference to the Puccini opera from which Rent was adapted. La Vie Bohème is a tribute to the artist's life, and in it, Larson name drops diverse influences that would make even a college professor proud. This includes poets Maya Angelou, Allen Ginsberg, Langston Hughes, Pablo Neruda, writers and thinkers like Gertrude Stein, Susan Sontag, filmmakers Antonioni, Bertolucci, and Kurosawa, musicians and composers like Bob Dylan, John Cage, Carl Orff, whose Carmina Burana is referenced, and the band the Sex Pistols. And finally, fellow theater makers Václav Havel, who later became the first president of the Czech Republic, Pee Wee Herman, and of course Stephen Sondheim. But make no mistake, it's not because Larson wanted everyone to read what he read or think the way he thought. He was advocating for having a wide range of knowledge to really understand the world and to build off of those who came before, whose shoulders we are all standing on. Or sitting on. 2. Vernacular. Larson's goal was to revolutionize musical theater.
I'm the future of musical theater, Scott.
And integral to that vision was his incorporation of what he called real rock. Sure, you had shows like Bye Bye Birdie, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Godspell, but by the 80s, rock music had largely moved beyond those sounds, and rock could rock harder. Larson said, "I write musicals with rock music, a contradiction in terms. Broadway's about 60 years behind anything you hear on the radio. You can't put rock on stage. Real rock, not warmed over easy listening pop, not plastic imitation 50s bubblegum. Nevertheless, that's what I'm trying to do." Now, this monologue was from the stage version of Tick, Tick, Boom and cut from the film. But essentially, Larson had a vision of what musicals should be, incorporating influences not just from the past, but also from what was happening in pop music at the time, music that was on the radio, on MTV, and shaping the tastes of a new generation. Larson said, "I feel that the American musical, this is like my mantra, has always been about pop music. Gershwin, Cole Porter, and Richard Rodgers were writing pop music of their day. What happened in the 60s was that people who could have been writing for the theater, Lennon and McCartney for instance, realized they didn't have to go down that road. They could just start a band and write songs for their band. That's why I feel popular music and theater music divided." Some composers like Sondheim actually welcomed this divide.
40 years ago, the theater stopped supplying hits, and so we were all freed by that once the pop revolution came in and once the 1950s really took hold. And it was a joy.
But by the time Larson was hitting his stride, the divide was becoming a problem.
He would go to the theater and he would be the youngest person there, and that bothered him. And he knew that if he wanted to write for the theater, he was going to have to write shows that his friends would sit through.
So he made it his mission to bridge the divide. Larson said, "My whole thing has been that there's no reason why pop cannot emanate from the theater and exist there." One of the reasons Sondheim supported Larson was because he recognized this artistic vision. Sondheim said about Larson that he was on his way to finding a real synthesis. We can still feel the residual issues of rock versus tradition when Ira pushes back on Larson's demand that there be a rock band for the reading.
I wrote a rock score. So, at the very least, I'll need a synth and drums and a guitar.
A request that would have been rare back then.
This is a reading. You'll have a piano.
Which, to his credit, he did try to work with.
I have convinced myself a rock and roll score sounds okay on just a piano.
And though Larson did later prove the dramatic potency of his rock with Rent,
You were right, I know.
It's important to note that he didn't limit himself to just that. Larson continued his eclectic curriculum into his eclectic choices of music. House music and rap in Today for You.
It was my lucky day today on Avenue A.
Spoken word performance art in Over the Moon.
Only thing to do is jump over the moon.
And hip-hop with Play Game.
Must be insane to play the play game.
And because of Larson's example, vernacular musical theater lives on. In fact, when Lin was originally writing, he tried to sound like Jonathan Larson.
My early attempts at writing musicals were all Larson knockoffs. I was trying to sound like him. And then In the Heights was the first time I started to sound like myself.
I.e., the music of Washington Heights, which turned out to be Latin musical styles, R&B, and hip-hop. But back to Rent. The idea of a show being based on the vernacular didn't just inform the music choices either, it was also reflected in the ticket policy as well. Rent producers Jeffrey Seller and Kevin McCollum created the first lottery system on Broadway where cash-strapped fans of musical theater could win low-price tickets at the hottest show on Broadway. Tim Kirkman would know because he won the lottery 10 times.
I won almost every time. I think I only lost once.
This helped keep the show connected to its fans, known as rent heads.
Like high school outcasts where you don't feel like you fit in anywhere. And somehow we all found something in the heart of the show that we could all identify with.
And I need to give a shout out here to Jeffrey Seller for his ability to spot revolutionary talent. See, because his track record didn't end with Larson and Rent. He went on to produce hit shows that appealed to a younger generation, such as Avenue Q and yes, In the Heights. His relationship with Lin-Manuel Miranda continued with producing Hamilton as well, providing a direct link between Larson and Lin. 3. Tradition. Larson himself valued the links between himself and the artists he looked up to, which is why Larson writes an homage to Sunday from Sunday in the Park with George. Tick, Tick, Boom reaches back to musical theater past for its inspiration and artistic lineage. It's worth noting that Sunday in the Park with George was Sondheim's own statement about artistic process and the struggle to get work produced and to not compromise one's vision. Sondheim's books detailing his writing process are named after lyrics from Sunday in the Park with George.
Finishing the hat. Look, I made a hat.
Larson also connects himself to Sondheim's first Broadway musical, West Side Story, with music by Leonard Bernstein, and now a Steven Spielberg movie. Larson quotes 2 songs from West Side Story in the song Why.
Got a rocket in your pocket.
Got a rocket in your pocket.
And the Jets are gonna have their day tonight.
The Jets are coming out on top tonight.
Got a Rocket in Your Pocket is especially notable because it comes from the song Cool, and the melody in Cool is remarkably similar to the opening guitar riff in Rent's opening number. Jonathan Larson literally and figuratively updated what was cool from the past. His desire to update things in an authentic way also led him to adapt La Bohème not just from the Puccini opera, but also from the book by Henri Morget upon which the opera is based. But of course, Larson does reference the opera, especially in using one of the opera's signature arias, Musetta's Waltz.
Roger will attempt to write a bittersweet, evocative song that doesn't remind us of Musetta's Waltz.
But it doesn't end there. The lyrics of Musetta's Waltz translates as, which resemble these lyrics.
Every single day, I walk down the street. I hear people say, baby, it's so sweet.
Which in turn I think might have inspired
Boys around the way holler at me every day, but I don't mind.
And as much as Larson talked about updating musicals, he also made sure to include traditional styles in Rent. For example, tango in Tango Maureen, gospel in Seasons of Love. In addition to using Musetta's Waltz, Larson also uses a waltz to signify the luxury apartments in No More, and even the traditional technique of a musical canon in Will I. Even in Tick, Tick, Boom, we get an older country style in Therapy. 4. You Only Live Once. In La Bohème, tuberculosis was ravaging the world of its characters. In Rent, Larson chose another disease that hit closer to home, which would be the one threatening his community. AIDS had claimed the lives of so many people, including musical theater legends like Michael Bennett and Howard Ashman. But closer to home, Larson's real-life friends were also dying of the disease. If those names sound familiar, it might be because you remember them from the life support group meeting in Rent.
Gordon.
Allie. Ham.
Larson literally wrote the musical Rent to memorialize his friends. Tick, Tick, Boom, the film, would later memorialize them as well.
I went to 3 friends' funerals last year. Pam, Gordon, Allie.
Which was compounded in tragedy by government indifference.
My friends are coughing and screaming from fevers that rage like runaway wildfires, yet the men with power send them nothing.
Exemplified in the infamously homophobic Senator Jesse Helms, which we see Larson responding to in the film. And Tim Kirkman also happens to know something about Jesse Helms. In 1998, Tim made an award-winning documentary about Helms called Dear Jesse.
Dear Jesse was a documentary feature film that I made in response to Senator Helms' barrage of attacks on the gay community, the arts, and AIDS funding.
What's stopping me? How about Jesse Helms and the moral majority?
He was the face of the anti-LGBTQ movement of that time.
When Michael tells John he has HIV in the film,
I'm HIV positive.
This comes directly from Jonathan Larson's own life, where his friend Matt O'Grady made a similar reveal to Larson. With death all around, Larson was confronted with the preciousness of the limited time we have on Earth.
The clock counts down the seconds as the flame gets closer and closer.
In Rent, He was obsessed with time, with counting it
525,600 minutes.
and telling us there's no day but today.
No day but today.
And in the song Why, Larson explains the importance of spending time on things that matter to him, such as creating new musicals.
I'm gonna spend my time this way.
Though Larson intended the ticking clock to be a metaphor, it turned out to be much more than that when he died at just the age of 35. This message landed with enormous weight when I saw the show 10 years ago in Los Angeles. The idea of turning 30 hit close to home because I was 30 at that time and had been struggling to get my musical noticed too. Watching Larson's story come to life did for me what it had done for Lin-Manuel Miranda 10 years earlier and gave me the blueprint to pursue a life in the theater. It's no mistake that Lin took Larson's sense of urgency and infused it into his own work, notably Hamilton, about a man who faces death early on in his life.
When I was 17, a hurricane destroyed my town. I didn't drown.
I think Hamilton was ready to die from the time he was 14 years old.
And spends his time writing like he's running out of time.
Tomorrow's not promised. I gotta get as much done as I can.
And of course, Lin ends Hamilton with a meditation on time.
It's only a matter of time.
Because as Larson taught so many of us, there is
No day but today.
When Jonathan Larson's agent gives him this piece of advice,
on the next one, maybe try writing about what you know.
It's a premonition of Rent, where Larson eventually did write about the community he knew. But more than just writing what he knew, he wrote what we needed to see. Representations of people who were diverse but did not call attention to their diversity, who were allowed to exist not as stereotypes, but as sympathetic people.
It was the most diverse cast I'd ever seen in a Broadway show, full stop.
Though Larson was a cisgender, heterosexual Jewish man, he centered so many characters who were different from himself, and he did it with love and compassion.
He was defending the people who he loved. We are people of color, bisexual performance artists, all of the people that are populating his world.
He saw how entire communities could be demonized, and he was determined to counter this by humanizing them. This impulse to humanize goes back to Hammerstein, whose song You've Got to Be Carefully Taught tackled racism.
You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be carefully taught.
This impulse was passed down to Stephen Sondheim, whose Pacific Overtures featured an all-Asian cast in 1976. Pacific Overtures was the first Sondheim show I ever saw, and it would have enormous impact on me as an Asian American composer. And later on, of course, I would recognize that impulse with Lin-Manuel Miranda, whose shows are famously diverse and who also pays homage to this lineage by a callback to You've Got to Be Carefully Taught.
I'm with you, but the situation is fraught. You've got to be carefully taught.
Perhaps the greatest lesson in Larson's curriculum is the idea of asking questions, a sort of musical Socratic method.
Often he would write these questions and then write the song to answer the question he was asking himself.
How do you measure a year? My dear. Is this real love?
Cages or wings, which do you prefer?
There's at least one question Jonathan Larson had a hand in answering.
What does it take to wake up a generation?
And the way he answered it was to continually learn about the world, to connect to the tradition while also questioning why it exists, and to broaden the scope of our humanity. And together with his mentor Stephen Sondheim, Larson has ensured that there is a bright future ahead for musical theater.
The main thing, though, is that it's first-rate work and has a future. And so do you. Meanwhile, be proud.
I'd like to thank J Collis and Tim Kirkman for their interviews. J Collis' book Boho Days and Tim Kirkman's film Dear Jessie are great. I'd also like to thank The Barn for their animation work on this video. The Barn is a production company dedicated to making indie movie musicals. Check them out on Instagram at The Barn. They have some amazing Disney animated movie breakdowns and a new musical, Steam, coming out soon. I'd also like to thank my patrons on Patreon. I have a lot more videos on Sondheim planned, so please subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.